All right, so once again, thank you everyone who is joining. If you're not a panelist, we ask that you turn off your cameras, mute your mics for this discussion. We're going to have a brief Q&A at the end of this discussion. If you're wanting to ask a question for a panelist to answer, post it in the chat and make it short and concise. We're going to pick a few of the questions for the panelists to answer at the very end. This diversity talk is hosted by College Inclusion and the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. My name is Sunny Wilson. I am the College Inclusion Ambassador Coordinator and will be moderator for this discussion, of which the topic is white privilege real? The panelists who have taken the time out of their busy schedules to join me for this discussion are Associate Professor of Sociology, Tracy Hayes, and Associate Professor of English and African American Literature, Shantae White Williams. Ladies, thank you for joining us. So we're going to jump straight into it. So what is white privilege? This term has been widely talked about in our society, especially in the past couple of years. I believe it's a note that we understand what the definition of this word means. The dictionary definition of this is that inherent advantage possessed by a white person on the basis of their race in society, characterized by racial inequality and injustice. White privilege is a concept that highlights the unfair societal advantages that white people have over non-white people, and is something that is pervasive throughout society and exists in all of our major systems and institutions that operate in society, as well as on an impersonal level. So starting off, we ask that Professor Hayes, if you will, to explain to us what the origin of this term is, where did it come from, and what it means for us today, if you will.
All right. So the term privilege of white skin first shows up right around, at least that I can document. Please understand that. 1824, in a British abolitionist, his name is James Stephens, The Slavery of the British West Indies. We see it again, white skin privilege, in 1910 with the National Council of the Congregation Churches of the U.S. publication of Social Equities. In 1935, W.E.B. Du Bois discusses it, but he doesn't use the term. I mean, it's really kind of discussed in the entire book of Black Reconstruction in America. But we see the term white privilege, the first time we really see it used together, just like we use it now, was in 1943 by sociologist Alfred McClung Lee, and he wrote a book about the Detroit riots in 1943. And I cannot get my hands on that book. I've been looking everywhere. I'm very interested in that book because when I started looking into the history of the term, I got very interested into it. So, I mean, you gave the brief definition. There are so many meanings behind it in the long run. I mean, it refers to the implicit, systematic, or systemic, I do it every time, advantages that people who are deemed white in a society have relative to those who are not considered white, which could go into an hour-long lecture of race that I'm not going to do. I'm going to pass it to Shantae for now.
Well, first, thank you for having me and inviting me to participate on this panel. The conversation of privilege is one that I think several of us have throughout the semester with a variety of students and a variety of classes for a variety of purposes. And so one thing that I think that's important to say in the beginning is that this is not a conversation that's comfortable for any party involved. It doesn't matter what race, what gender, what age, where you're from. Ain't nobody happy about white privilege, not one person. So in that, I think it's important that you come into any conversation like this in recognizing that it's just a hard conversation to have. But with that said, a lot of the conversations that are absolutely essential in life are the hard conversations to have. So I think it's important to kind of breathe in that space as we move forward into, these kind of conversations, and particularly just with the title, right? The diversity talk title is white privilege real? Which from a rhetorical perspective to me is like, oh, we get to fight because it was already put up like we're going to question the idea of what it was. So I do think it's important to kind of acknowledge the space and acknowledge that it's a loaded term for people. When I define, white privilege, as I always start with the idea of privilege in general, right? I think it's really difficult sometimes for people to say, white privilege is real, because the idea here, especially looking at, our student population, is most of us ain't rich. All of us have problems. When you're thinking about privilege, I'm not a Walton. what are you talking about, right? And so I think that's important to kind of grapple with too, in terms of what we think of when we think of a unearned advantage, right? Something that I didn't ask for, and most of the time I am unaware that I'm walking with it. Right. So I start off by saying, like, when I want you to think about privilege, I want you to think about really simple things in your life. Like, I love to shop. I go shopping all the time. Anybody that's ever met me, this is not a surprise, right? I have never in my life thought before I walked out my house, I wonder if I'm going to fit in the door at a store that I'm going into, right? Never thought about it at all, period. The fact that I've never had to think about it is a privilege, right? That it's not afforded to everyone. Another example I like to use for people to better understand the concept is just the idea of being American. I love to travel. I've been to lots of countries. And sometimes I look at my passport and I think, man, this country is just gangster. The passport literally says, she's a citizen of the United States. And I'm paraphrasing here. Mess with her if you want to. We will come get her. We expect that you are going to represent and respect her rights no matter where she is in the world, right? On top of that, the State Department will come and get me when I go places. Even if they've told me, don't go there. They put out these warnings, don't go there, right? If I go there and I have a problem, they are literally going to come get me. Not a better example of that than COVID-19 when it happened last spring, and the State Department literally brought Americans home from abroad in droves for whatever reason that you were there. These are privileges that I did not earn, I didn't ask for, and I don't think about. I simply was born, right? And so I do think it's a good place to start when we start talking about that broader conversation of white privilege, is kind of centering it in things that maybe we all can connect to. And I feel like I talked a lot, so.
Well, we appreciate that. And so you mentioned it being a loaded question, the title of our discussion here. And it actually is. And I wanted to make it that way because I think it's something that a lot of people talk about in society. You know, do I have privilege? Is it something that as a white person that I have to find myself coming into recognition with, because of my skin color? So I want to ask also, what has perpetrated this privilege? What is the cause for where we find that white people have privilege if this is the case? And either when you can start, feel free.
Oh dear. I mean, technically the privilege goes back to the founding, even before that. I mean, we can really see you kind of, again, like I said, I was trying to avoid the lecture of race, but you don't even see race discussed. That's not a term that is used until at the earliest we can see it is 1450. And it is, I'm not going to go into the lecture. I knew this was going to be difficult, but it is specifically used to define, to allow slavery in Portugal. And after that, we then start seeing the term used more and more for those who want to own slaves. And that is where it all goes back to. Because if we go back and people like to think that we don't need to talk about our history, the uncomfortable history, the true history. And we have to talk about it. It doesn't just fix itself. It doesn't just go away. We have to understand how we got to 2021, how we still have the racial inequalities, the class inequalities, the gender inequalities, the sexuality inequalities that we have today.
So usually they can mute the audio.
And
Tracy, for just a moment here.
No
we
problem.
ask that everyone who has joined, if you can, go ahead and mute yourselves and turn off your cameras so that way we can allow our speakers to speak for us, please. Thank you.
But the whole point is just to understand that everything within our history directly affects where we are today. Our laws are built upon that history. Our society is built upon
I think you're fine. Okay, I'll just they
and dehumanization of Native Americans. And even when we start looking into race, we have to understand, and I'm teaching race and ethnicity right now, and we are on the immigration chapter, and we keep wanting to talk about African Americans and Native Americans, and it's a very big difference. Those that chose to come here, even though they are still discriminated against, is very different than people's history who have lived here or were brought here against their will. And that treatment has always been different, and laws have been passed and still exist to treat people differently. And so to look at that privilege, the privilege in and of itself to not have to think about race and to think that racism doesn't exist, that's a privilege, or to not have to focus on it every single day. That's a privilege that I have. I could easily choose that route. And I obviously chose not to take that route. I might spend way too much time not taking that route. But it's one that's important if we're going to look for any kind of equality within a society. And we have to cover it. We have to discuss it. And the same way with Shantae, I knew I kept seeing, is white privilege real? And I'm thinking, do they realize the people that they have on the, I know you do. I help put it together, but I'm like, this is not going to be really a debate, because by debating it, by saying it's not real, it's saying racism isn't real. And I'm sorry, as a sociologist, that's definitely not going to happen with me. Shantae.
I will jump in there. Yeah. So I couldn't agree with you more. So this is going to be more of a love fest, people. Just be prepared. I think part of the question that was asked was about, how we see this perpetuated, right? And, Tracy is absolutely right in terms of thinking about when we see racism occur, the term in history and its origins, and the reasons why, right? One thing that I'm always fascinated about within this conversation is the idea that it's always going to be a system that perpetuates itself. I think too often people think of privilege as something that is personal, right? Too often people think of racism as something that is personal, and it can be, but the average person is not, running around calling people out their name and stuff like that. That's typically not the issue. But there are systems that perpetuate this. So hopefully if this works, I'm gonna put a link in the chat of an article that I use in one of my literature courses quite often, where it's a excerpt from a larger book about who's Black in America, right? And I'm using this as an example just because examples are great and it's an interesting read, and you'll have it if you want to look at it. But it really talks about the systematic ways legally in which race has been defined in this country, right? We'll center it here in the good old United States of America, right? So when we're talking about privilege, right, what this article shows and what we know is that even the privilege to name who you are is white privilege, right? That a bunch of old white men in a room somewhere sat around and decided who's going to be Black, who's going to be colored, who's going to be Negro, who's going to be a citizen, who gets to vote, who gets to everything else. None of those things were even a privilege of self-determination. And so I think when we have this conversation, it's really important to recognize that it's not just the way one person feels, right? That we can see it in the legal system, we can see it in housing. More than anything in my life, because I'm right here at SWIC, I see it in education, right? Both very locally and, globally. And so I think that it's just really important to recognize that it's not a personal thing, right? Or, that's not the onus of it. It is a system, and that we have to recognize how these systems perpetuate themselves.
Appreciate that. So we talked about how it originated and where it kind of started from. So I would also ask, and if you may, whichever one you can start, with this, how does it exist and manifest in our society? I know you said in the education system and in housing. So if you will, if one of you would explain, maybe if you can narrow down exactly where you see where white privilege is something that is in our major institutions in our society today.
So I could say just pick an area, really.
Sure.
I think probably you mentioned Peggy McIntosh, and so she became very, familiar because she listed out examples that were so accessible to everyone, right? Like, I love my hair, I love my puffs, right? But there was a time in my life that if I chose to go on vacation, I knew I had to take every hair product that I ever had any intention of using with me, because it was not a given that I could walk into a Walgreens, a Walmart, or any other store and find products that I needed. Whereas if I was white, in terms of white privilege, I could walk into Walmart and have 2 or 3 aisles of appropriate things for my hair. In 2021, has some of that changed? Yes. Has all of it? No. This is why it's important to situate things historically. Another example that I think really affects us today is housing, right? When we think about generational wealth, one, but more importantly to me, access, right? So we can look and legally see, in charters for different cities, all kinds of policies that are written down in easy and plain language where people could live here, people could live there, people could live here, depending on what religion or what race you are. Home loans were given based on if you were able to buy in those particular communities. This is not centuries ago. This is decades ago. But when you say decades, right, think of it like this. Eventually, it did become illegal to say, hey, if you're Black, you can't live in this neighborhood. But if I work for, Coldwell Banker or some other realtor, and my business policy says, Shantae, we're not going to let you work for us, or we're going to pull your license if you sell to a person of color in this neighborhood, then that policy continues even when the law comes off the books, right? And then we think of the ways that we build wealth in this country. Often it comes from generational wealth. If your parents owned a home, right, and then they were able to sell that home and make money, or not have to pay a mortgage once it was paid off and put you through college. All of those things pass down to the generation where we are absolutely right now. And the last example I'll give is about access, because a big part of white privilege is not necessarily about a good, right? Whether that's going to be hair products or money or a house, right? It's about the environment in the world that you get to live in. So we know within the education system that we have the whole, separate but equal, Plessy versus Ferguson thing. They say, y'all fine wherever y'all are, just be away from each other. And then eventually, progress does happen, and that changed, right? But if we look at our neighborhoods now, it ain't changed that much, right? There might be 1 or 2 Black people in your kids' kindergarten class, maybe, an Asian American, maybe, right? But for a lot of our population, particularly here in Belleville, that hasn't changed, right? And so when we think about what you have access to, the people, the culture, the experiences, the mentorships, right? Those things are a product of white privilege that we can see directly connected to both laws and policies throughout history that continue to affect us every single day. When you think about your parents, when you think about your grandparents, when you think about myself, right? People marry who they go to school with, right? People hire people they go to school with. People hire friends of friends that went to the same college, right? These are all ways in which that privilege perpetuates itself, because those doors were not accessible to certain communities, and in some ways are still not.
All right, thank you for that. Now, Tracy, did you want to interact with that at all?
I'm going to go, the racial wealth gap is the most well-known and easily accessible evidence you can look at privilege. And for one, I have a YouTube video. I actually just found this lesson. I use Richard Rothstein regularly in my class. I make them listen to like a 30-minute podcast. And now I've learned that there's an 8-minute video saying the same thing. And so I'm going to post it in here as well. And it goes through that history. What we need to understand, and exactly what Shantae just said, every major metropolitan area in this country is still segregated. In most areas, we are more segregated today than we were when it was law. St. Louis is the second most segregated city in the country. We have 161 municipalities, every one of them built along lines of race. Most people do not understand how segregated St. Louis really is until you start looking into the research and understanding it. But even going before that, how we got to that point, it all comes back to that wealth. African Americans make 60% of the income that white Americans make today, give or take. But they have 5% of the wealth that white Americans have. On average, white American households have $171,000 worth of wealth. And when I hear that number, I always kind of, what? No, we don't. Because look, I'm from East St. Louis. I'm from Cahokia. I was raised in Washington Park. I'm the first person to ever go to college in my family. I can, it's the same thing of when I first heard privilege, I don't have any privilege. We didn't have anything. Yeah, I do. I can know that now. You learn it. It's uncomfortable. But I can easily go, I don't have that much wealth. But when you start looking into it, it's the housing. And the housing is so important. And that's what that video is going to talk about. Because enslaved people were not allowed to own anything. They were free labor, right? They were abused. So they had no wealth. The generation after slavery was actually allowed to purchase land, and they were able to get a little bit of political power, a little bit too much too quickly. And that's where Jim Crow laws came in at. So by the even by the 1890s, the accumulation of land, which land is wealth, that they had at the time is taken away, legally removed from them, anything they'd accumulated. And then Jim Crow is the laws are in place for the next 3 generations at least. So you really don't get, during this whole time period, you have white families who are able to buy houses at a very decent price, much more affordable than they are today. Maybe $5,000, $6,000 at the time. So let's say a $30,000, $40,000, depending on the year you're looking at, that they can turn around and let's sell for $500,000, $600,000, $700,000, $500,000 or more, that they can use the money to send, and I'm seriously almost saying the words you're going to see on that video because it's the same thing, to send their children to college, to have their children, pay for a starter house. And I may not have had that, but that doesn't mean that as a group it isn't there, and that's where we see it. But just looking at that alone, it's not until, so housing laws don't get changed until 1968. That's not that long ago. During that time period, Black people couldn't move where they wanted to go. They couldn't afford to. And even when they can, they don't have the wealth to do it anymore. They don't have the ability to. So we talk about, as a whole, with the racial wealth gap and why a larger percentage of Black and Hispanic people are in poverty today. It was through the law. It is through policies. It was literally the law to keep these groups in poverty. And I don't want to leave out Native Americans. They always get left out, and they're poor. That group is poorer. Even in my textbooks, it drives me insane. It's more poor than any other group in this country, and are constantly taken advantage of as well. And you're going to see privilege come into play there as well, to not even really have to think about it. Pass it over.
Well, thank you for that. So we talked about the wealth gap. I know many people on the opposing side of if white privilege is a thing will say, well, there's the Asian community. They are one of the most wealthiest people that live in our country. So they would say that Asian Americans have some form of privilege also. And so it's not really narrowed down to white privilege, but it's also other races have privilege. So how would you guys interact with that type of conversation? Would you say that all people have some form of privilege in whatever way, shape, or form, or is it just specifically white privilege in this country?
I'll jump in. I think it's important that we relate this conversation to the position of power and authority in a society. So I can want anything I want to, but whether I have the ability to make that desire actual is a whole different conversation when we're talking about privilege, right? And so there is a real need to understand, right, that white privilege is equated in a lot of ways to white power. And if you did not have that power, those privileges would not be the same. So if you're talking about groups that don't have the power to influence wide-reaching systems and cultural items, then it's very difficult to associate privilege in the same way, right? So for example, we were in the whole idea of money and generational wealth, right? But there are lots of ways that white privilege asserts itself. For instance, as Tracy was talking about, the choice to interact with different races. In my life, even if I wanted to, there is no way that I could choose to never be around another white person again. Not at work, not at home, not at the store, not on TV, nothing. I can't make that choice. Right? That doesn't work the other way. And that's true whether I'm Asian, Indian, whatever the case may be. That in my life, I have no choice, even more so for me, but to be interracial, right? So it's a privilege to not have to make that choice in and of itself. So that would be my response to someone that said, well, people think, Asian Americans have it all great going on. That's still someone else defining who they are.
Thank you for that. Tracy, did you want to?
I'm going to take it right back, though, to what I said earlier. There's a difference between those that chose to immigrate and groups that are systemically oppressed. And that doesn't mean that there's no oppression and no discrimination. Absolutely. The amount of hate crimes has increased over 700% in the last year for Asian Americans. It's not saying it doesn't exist, but it's like comparing apples to oranges. There is definitely legislation we can look at in the past, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the history of oppression against, Chinese American and Japanese American, or even the discussion of how many groups of people are put into the term Asian American, but it's still going to be very different compared to those who were brought here against their will, or those that were already here and had everything taken from them. You're going to have a different history. You're going to have different laws. And it happened later on. There are so many different aspects, but again, to me, that's always apples to oranges. It's such a different situation.
Thank you for that. Once again, we ask that everyone that has joined to go ahead and mute your cameras, if you will, and your mics. We appreciate your cooperation. So with that being said about the Asian community, and then you guys gave, pretty good examples of why this wouldn't fit in that reality. Also, what a lot of people will say on the opposing view will say, well, it's not necessarily it's more of a cultural thing, or they'll say it's more of a skin color thing, or it's more of an ethnicity thing. So for instance, one person that is of a white descent who was adopted by Black parents, do they still have, the white privilege in that sense because of their skin color? Or if somebody's raised in a cultural Black family, or even vice versa, where you have Black people who are raised in a white family, do they have some type of privilege because of that? How would you guys interact with that?
I would generally just start with, if you take a white person who was raised in a Black culture or Black family, they may be more aware, but when they walk into a store with that Black family, that individual is going to be less likely to be followed than, and we know this, than their family members. I see you laughing. But it's just in general, when we talk about privilege, we look at the things that we take for granted. When I get pulled over, no, I'm not happy, but I'm also really not worried I'm going to get harmed by the cops. And I know it's an uncomfortable conversation, and it's one nobody wants to talk about. But we have the evidence, we have the numbers, the data that unarmed African Americans are 3 times more likely to be killed than if not more. Keep in mind, the only data we're getting is released by usually the police themselves. And it's not, again, this is not anti-police. You always have to state that, and I'm glad. But when we talk about things like police brutality, yes, it happens across racial lines and ethnic lines and cultural lines, but it happens to some groups more. The NAACP, for the first time in history in 2017, put out a travel warning for Missouri, the first time ever for a state in this country for African Americans to be careful while driving through the country. And it's not just to cause issues, it's the fact of the amount of people who are pulled over just for being Black. Versus, I don't have to think about that as somebody who is white. Now, culturally, I may have to think about something different if I go to a completely different culture, like when I go to England, but I'm still going to fit in there until I open my mouth. That's a big time I can usually not fit in anymore. It happens all the time. And so when we talk about it, yeah, you can talk about it culturally, and that still doesn't mean it's not there. The white skin privilege, which is according what we see it's starting out to be termed as, is just to people, so people avoid suspicion. You don't have to worry about the suspicion or being afraid of somebody because of what they look like. That's kind of the basic of what we look at with white privilege.
And I laughed because the example that you used was similar to what was going on in my head, right? So my mom is white, or she was before she passed. My dad is Black. So I cannot tell you how many times in my life it has been completely obvious to me the difference in the way I was treated, even as a young child, based on which of my parents I was with, right? Because it's not about me. right? It's about the associations that someone else makes when they look at a situation, and then they are making decisions and determinations from whatever their perspective is, right? So it doesn't matter if that person is white and has Black parents, because when another person looks at that person or interacts with that person, they are making their judgments based on whatever their biases, implicit or otherwise, whatever their perceptions are, no matter what or who that person might be. That really has nothing to do with the whole conversation. And I think it's really interesting to me. There have been many times in my life that I've explained to people that I know I can choose to define myself as whatever I want to. I can say I'm biracial. I can say I'm white. I can say whatever I want to. But when people look at me, they see an African American woman, and I'm very happy about that. I don't have no problems with it. Hey, we good with that. But it doesn't matter. I don't get to define for myself who I am or what people will assume that I am, right? There's a cultural standard, a norm, and then that's going to be applied to you no matter what your personal circumstances or upbringing or viewpoints or whatever, fill in that blank might be. And so I do think that there is a white skin privilege, but it's not just the skin, it's also the name. My first name is Shantae. My middle name is Nicole because I was born in the 70s, and apparently every girl has born in the 70s, middle name is Nicole. And earlier in my career, when I was still in college, there were times when I would put on my resume C Nicole instead of Shantae Nicole. Now I'm grown now, and so I look at things a lot differently than I did when I was 19 and 20, right? And I had kids to feed, and I didn't care if you were discriminating against me or not. I just wanted a job, right? But I know, and from experience, that taking Shantae off of my resume caused me to get better job offers and interviews. So that privilege is not just about how you look, it's about the way you are situated within a larger power structure of our culture.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for that. I also would like to ask, you mentioned Shantae about being of mixed descent, and somebody who also is of mixed descent, I totally understand where you're coming from. But we also see that people will say, well, for instance, if somebody's born to Black and white parents, they'll say if the child comes out with white skin, for instance, let's say that they have been white privileged. Would you guys say that they would have white privilege even though they are of mixed descent? Or would you say that it's something more culturally that people see, or it's more of an implicit bias? How would you interact with that?
No, you don't have white privilege. I mean, there's no other way to put that but a firm no. And if I could say it 25 times, I would. That doesn't mean there aren't other types of discriminatory practices that happen. So I would refer you to information on colorism before I would speak to anything else. But it's, again, not the same because it's not the same power structures in terms of the effects from the privilege. Right? What happens, not just to you, but then generationally because of it. So.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. Tracy, did you?
I would have went straight to colorism.
Colorism?
It's, the fact that just today I saw on Twitter, is it Lovecraft Country, I think is what it is, on HBO, popular show, of an extra whose skin was darkened for a specific scene. We've seen history has shown us of the lightening of skin in order, like Beyonce had her, I want to state, for magazines, right? No? Oh no, go ahead.
Okay, so you're not gonna go off after B. We're just not gonna do that. We're gonna have to, Tracy, I love you, but not the queen.
Oh no, I wasn't saying anything bad about the queen. I want you to know that. No, she didn't do it. What I'm saying is on a magazine cover, the magazine photoshopped it. Oh no, we ain't gotta worry about that one.
I just want to say it for the people so they understand.
No, not at all. It's there's not the choice, right? That's how the photoshopping and ads and commercial. Well, now we can see it, of course, with CGI and things like that work. But even going back to the other advertisements, the constant lightening of skin is that no matter kind of the background, it was still trying to at least portray, again, not the individuals themselves were doing it, not that doesn't happen with different cultures and things, but the way that in particular, African-American women have been portrayed throughout our media, throughout our history. But with the going back to biracial, I mean, look, when President Obama was running for president, we constantly heard about how he was a mixed president. But and then anything negative was he was the Black president afterwards, even when he was elected. And then that's all we ever, and it's okay. That goes back to the history of the one drop rule and understanding that history. But very rarely do people talk about Obama as being mixed. It's always Black. And that's fine. But that's how we tend to, as part of the white privilege, is being able to choose how you want to talk about something that you have absolutely nothing to do with. I don't have any history in this, you know, like Shantae and you do, but knowing how and seeing how it's played out and used, especially against those who are mixed. We didn't even legally have a category for mixed or biracial until the year 2000 in this country, because our categories that are legally defined are according to the census data. There was no biracial, there was no multi. Of course, people were biracial, but we didn't legally define it. So it's still going to be usually considered Black, just going all the way back to one drop. And then you can go even more. I'm done there.
All right. Well, thank you for that. So we got two more questions here. We're going to ask it briefly, and then we're going to have also the Q&A. So once again, everybody who has joined, if you want to ask a question during the Q&A, go ahead and post it to the chat, and then we'll allow our panelists here to interact with those questions. So what we also hear is that many would say that this idea or ideology of white privilege that's promulgated in our society is kind of detrimental. They'll say that it's leading people to view people who have white skin in a negative connotation, and is actually, some would say, even reverse racism. So how would you deal with that type of thing? Whichever one.
How you gonna mute yourself? I mean, avoiding racism is detrimental to our society. Avoiding the systemic inequalities is detrimental, more so than anything else. And not even just with racism, but all of, you know, classism, gender, all of that. Ignoring it is just causing more and more division. And although I do hear people who want to, you know, who would, say, well, talking about white privilege is causing division. No. It might for some people, but if you're uncomfortable talking about it, well, I mean, that's kind of the proof of, and granted, you're absolutely right that most people do get uncomfortable, but if you're really uncomfortable with this conversation, that's that privilege. You have not had to discuss it in the past, and you have been able to push it off, and you have been able to call reverse racism, which if we really want to get into some actual, there we go back to the power system. There's a difference between prejudice, discrimination, and racism. And if racism is about a power structure, and who has the power to take away jobs, to make sure people are not allowed to buy houses where they want to buy it. Yeah, it's not the minority groups, and I don't even like using the term, but that's how power structures work. And so reverse racism, show me, you know, where 40% of white Americans are behind bars for laws that were made specifically to put them behind bars as a group. I'd like to see it. And I wouldn't like to see it, by the way. Can I just take that back? I don't ever want to see any group in that sense. I mean, I'd like to see the statistics for that argument. But talking about our history, especially the hard parts of our history, the uncomfortable parts, is the only way we're going to be able to come together and move forward and dealing with that history. Look, we're 2021, and all we've done in our history, well, we deny it. We just don't talk about those things. That doesn't fit. That doesn't help things. That doesn't fix things. I tell my students this, that I've had a problem with my sink for 6 years, and I've just kind of avoided it and bailed out the water and thinking, oh, please just fix yourself. It still hasn't fixed itself. It's just gotten worse. And that's exactly what happens when you don't confront problems, including problems of racism in society.
Thank you for that. Shantae?
Do you want me to talk, or do you want to go to the next question? Because I'm not sure what your timing looks like.
Well, it looks like no one has put any questions in the chat, so we can go ahead and allow you to speak.
So I think I would completely agree to say I don't know of problems that get solved by ignoring them, right? I mean, it might feel good to be able to do that, but if we want to, you know, realize the dream of the promise of America. I don't think that we have the ability to ignore issues and not look for real, solutions to make our society, more equitable. I don't think we have the ability to do that. I certainly hope that, that my students and my children are all thinking about ways in which they can make the world better. And that means asking ourselves these really difficult questions, recognizing what the problem is, and then thinking about how we choose to move forward. So with that said, I think the conversation really moves toward like how we define ourselves. And I'm a huge fan of Ibram Kendi, and I love when he talks about the difference between, a racist, a segregationist, and an anti-racist, right? The racist people, he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but read all of it. If you see him on a YouTube video, just watch it. I don't care what it is. But anyway, he says are the people that we recognize. These are the people walking around with the Nazi t-shirts on. These are the people that, use racial slurs frequently. We know who they are. We look at them, we're like, okay, like none of us, that's one thing, right? And then we have this category of people that are not that, right? They would never use that word. They would never, do those things. They would never wear that shirt, right? But they're also not anti-racist. So anti-racist means that we're actively working to dismantle some of these things, right? So I'll give you an example. Education is my thing, so it's kind of my wheelhouse and where I live at, right? The idea is that, if I choose to want to donate to a college, right? I want people to go to college. It's awesome. It's wonderful. I'm going to donate to a scholarship program, right? Most people, or a lot of people, might choose to donate to a scholarship program at the college that they went to, right? Most institutions in this country are predominantly white institutions. So when I donate that money to the college that I went to, right, I'm perpetuating a system that already exists. Am I racist for saying I'm donating to the college that I went to? No, right? Am I saying I don't want my money to go to fill in the blank for minorities? No, right? But to be anti-racist, I have to recognize the systems that have went before and then make a determination that I don't want to continue the status quo, but I want to move forward in that conversations, which means I think about if everybody that only went to predominantly white institutions only donate to predominantly white institutions, then I maintain the status quo. If I want to be anti-racist, then I have to choose to donate to something else. And so I hope that example makes sense, right? But it really is about who we choose to be. And that's how I see the privilege conversation. I don't just want to be able to sit in this, forum and say, okay, now I understand what white privilege is. I want to feel empowered to be able to say, I want to be anti that. Now, how do I go out and make sure that my actions, my deeds, my interactions move us toward a society where this is less of a problem?
Thank you for that, Shantae. So the last question I have before we enter into our Q&A session is, what advice would you give to students of all races in reference to diversity and inclusion, especially here on campus, and better ways, to make each of us all feel included as we all go to school together and try to gain an education?
I guess I'll jump in. That's easy, right? The best things to do are to immerse yourself in things that are not endemic to you, right? Get out of your comfort zone. That means instead of taking, even though I teach it and I love it, introduction to fiction, take African-American literature, take women's literature, take something different so that you're experiencing something different. I hear students say all the time when they come into classes, like, it's weird being in a class with fill in the blank, right? Whether that's going to be whatever. It seems different than what you are. That's the only way that you really recognize where you are and then gain cultural competency, which allows you to be able to have these type of conversations. That means I choose to go to movies. I choose to read books from all kinds of different cultures and different times of different people in different kinds of periods of time, right? But that requires you to do it because our culture is going to put the majority culture forward in front of your face with so prolifically you won't even know it. So if you don't make those choices, then you stay where you are.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Tracy.
That's it. I mean, get uncomfortable. Get uncomfortable. Fine. I mean, nobody wants to be uncomfortable. but you learn more when you're uncomfortable. When you are taking up information that you don't understand or that's new to you and you are uncomfortable talking about, especially as a white student, learn about different cultures, learn about different races. We like to think that we already have. We have this myth of meritocracy that everybody has been treated the same and that everybody has the same chances. It doesn't even have to be about race. Read about class. Read W.E.B. Du Bois. That was a hard read when I was in college. I am not going to lie. It's still a hard read, but look into them. Read Ibram Kendi. That I'm glad you brought him up. Read How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's a fantastic book. I'm still working my way through it. Look at other cultures in general. Watch movies from Bollywood. Watch things that are out of, what is the norm and what is popular, and ask questions. That's where I always and ask if somebody doesn't know the answer. Now, I know not everybody follows this the way I do, but if I don't know the answer, I'm going to find somebody who does to answer it for you, or I'm going to get the answer for you. But ask questions. Ask uncomfortable questions.
Mm-hmm.
Like Shantae said, take African American literature, take race and ethnicity, let me tell you, granted, I'm promoting my own class, and that could bring up a whole nother topic.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we only, why is a white teacher teaching rate, that's a whole other topic and one that definitely needs to be discussed. But that's just it. Get uncomfortable. We learn when we're uncomfortable. We remember what we learn. How about that? We remember what we learn when we're uncomfortable. If we're just sitting there learning the same history we've already learned or things that we already know, we kind of just doze off. I'm just as bad. It's trying to
be intentional. Like one thing that I teach is having a cultural competency plan, right? So make a list of all the things that you have never done or you've heard of, but you didn't, know how to do that. So a couple of years ago, one of the things that I put on my plan was I'd never been to a pride parade. Go figure. Don't know how that happened in my life. So I was like, I feel like this is something that I should experience because I know that, this is really important cultural part of the way this, group celebrates themselves. And I want to have the ability to have a better understanding of that. Now, did I have to do a little bit of research about the who, when, why, and where? Did I want to make sure that I was going with a group or a person that I was comfortable with? And then, I told you about the shopping. So, I had to research what was appropriate to wear and then what I wanted to wear. But that's me, right? Because that's what it takes when we're uncomfortable to plan and prepare and choose to immerse ourselves in something different. Then there's been times that I've done similar things and I was like, okay, I did that. I won't do that again. The Pride Parade wasn't that. But, but it's the point that this is how we learn and this is how we expand.
Well, thank you, ladies, for that. So we're going to go ahead and enter into our Q&A session here. Looks like we have 3 questions. So the first one says, what can we do when we hear or see racism from family members or a person in a position of power?
Okay, I guess I'll jump in.
It's kind of broad. We can narrow it down here. We got, like I said, 2 more. And if you could just speak on these.
We can go back and forth or something like that. Okay. I'd say the first thing I would say is that you have to recognize that you have a right to be yourself, right? And to be comfortable and to be safe, right? So I don't think that any one individual should feel like it's their responsibility to confront or change because that can be very, traumatic and in some cases dangerous. So I will say that, right? That doesn't mean there aren't ways to address it, particularly within family structures, if you feel like you have the ability to talk to someone in a way that they were going to listen, right? So at my heart, I am a rhetoric professor, which is about effective communication, right? Are you the right person to have that conversation? Are you in the right setting to have that conversation? And then do you have the tools to have that conversation? So I would ask myself those questions before I engage. The other part of that is that I do a lot of this work, right? So I will say that the thing that I find is most effective and it's going to sound cheesy, but it works for me, is I approach everybody in love, right? Doesn't really kind of matter how you treat me or whatever the case may be. I try very hard to always assume the best about a person and to meet people where they are. So if you can't do that, then you probably aren't the person that they are going to listen to. Now, do you have a right to be angry and do whatever? Go for it. I don't have no problems with that either. There are consequences to everyone's actions, and there's some things that if you do, you deserve to, have the consequences met. I don't have that issue either. But if this is about wanting to enlighten people, wanting to have real meaningful conversations and possibly progress, that's a different approach. And I think that has to be done in love.
Thank you, Shantae.
I'm going to agree with just the point of treating people with respect. Even if you come at somebody angrily, they don't listen. We know this. They immediately kind of shut you out. But one thing I would say, especially with family and following what Shantae said, making sure that you feel safe in that situation and not putting yourself in that. But as white people, we have the responsibility to talk to other white people. And what we tend to do we have done for decades is to say, well, we don't talk about race because that's politics, and we don't talk about politics. Look, race is human rights. Okay, it's not politics. I know that it gets swept under the politics rug. This isn't about Republican and Democrat or liberal or independent or conservative. This is about treating people equally with respect, making sure people have human rights in society that we all deserve. And so this idea that we shouldn't talk about it, going back to kind of the colorblind racism, which I don't even think we did bring up, but colorblind racism, or I don't see color, or we shouldn't discuss it, again, is why we're here in 2021 instead of having these uncomfortable discussions. But not everybody is going to be able to, again, I do this work. I can have these discussions regularly. People expect, my family now, they have always, since I was a child, 10, 11 years old, expected these discussions from me, even when they didn't like it. Because I was always in the library, reading and things like that. I wasn't always right, by the way. I want to put that out there. I had a lot of mistakes. Make mistakes, though. That's how you learn, especially when you're learning about different races, different genders, sexuality, and so on. We need to learn these things. But treating people with respect is again, you can confront people respectfully.
And then the last thing I'll just add that, I just want to also say is know what the policies are in wherever you're working, wherever you're going to school. You're a student here at SWIT. There are policies that will protect you. You can take it as a title complaint right to Human Resources. No one has to, that you will be protected, right? So it's not going to be like you have to confront an administrator, or you have to confront a safety officer, right? That there are offices that deal with it in institutions like this one, and you should be able to do that and reach out to people who are willing, like myself and Tracy, to help you facilitate those conversations so that you are in a safe place.
Thank you, ladies, for that. So the next question is just kind of a broad question, so if we can narrow it down a little bit, but it says the controversy over affirmative action.
That would be a whole diversity talk on its own. And particularly the controversy tends to be that around a complete myth. The majority of people who get in on affirmative action are white. There is a fantastic documentary, and you don't hear me say these words much, but MTV made a fantastic documentary that I actually use in class. Again, you don't hear those words much. And it's called White People. You can get it on YouTube. And it follows around and asks these kind of questions and it's just everyday people having discussions about it. I can't recommend that one enough. I use that in class because it does show you the facts. And there's a reason it keeps, these controversies keep getting knocked down by the Supreme Court. They're not legit controversies.
I completely agree with that, and saying that, what people think about a lot of topics versus what they are completely different. And what I will say about it in regards to white privilege, that affirmative action is one of the best examples of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, if a company is required to make a diversity hire out of 50 people, it's going to be a white woman almost every time.
You're not wrong. Yeah.
All right, thank you for that. So the next question is, can we correct the unconscious prejudice that one has?
Gosh, okay, I'm just going to be honest. The research says maybe not. I mean, not without a whole lot of work. So in my classes, very often we use a book called Blind Spot that talks about unconscious bias, things that our brain is doing that we're unaware of and sometimes don't even agree with what our brain is thinking. And because that programming happens so, thoroughly throughout our lives, that most of the research says in terms of unconscious bias, to unprogram that, you would have to dedicate like that same amount of time and effort, right? If you got it because you were immersed in one thing, then you'd have to immerse yourself in another thing. And I'm not so sure that a culture that is, culturally equitable exists to immerse yourself in. So I don't know what to say besides we hope we're going to find the answer to that, but I don't think we do yet.
Gotcha.
Same thing. I mean, we know that it's going to be difficult at the starting at young age in education. We can work on the next generations, but are we going to be able to do it with our generation and even ourselves? We have that implicit bias. It's very difficult. I catch myself daily with it, with something. And it doesn't matter how long I teach about it and teach implicit bias. And now you have a book you've given me to read. Thank you. But it's still there. It's socialized. It is part of our lives. And we've been socialized into it. I just did a whole lecture today on Disney movies, and gender and class and race in Disney movies. And that's, again, a whole nother diversity talk.
Gotcha. Well, thank you, ladies, for that. So another question says, how would you deal with the obvious expression of white privilege in your work environment?
For me, in my role, and I'll talk particularly here at SWIC because I've been here for forever, it seems, I am always very conscious that I am going to often be the only person of color in the room. And so in my role here, I feel like my mom used to always say to me, and I've said this a million times, if you're in the room, be in the room. And so I make it a point maybe more than some people would like, to point out things, because I think that education is the first step, right? We talked about why should we even be having this conversation, but if we cannot identify an issue, then we cannot work on it. So I think for me, within my workplace, my first step is identifying it. And then my second step is what agency do I have to address policies that I feel perpetuate that? Particularly within the workplace, I think hiring policies often fall into those categories. That if you are hiring people where a lot of jobs rank different backgrounds in a particular way. If you went to a particular school, then this ranks higher on our recruitment. Or they hire based on, well, this person is a person that I know, but we already discussed that we live in segregated communities, right? Or I worked at this person at a previous institution, right? Those type of things. So for me, it's about pointing out the areas in which these very systemic racist things perpetuate themselves, having nothing to do with that individual. So if we can't address those policies, right? If we don't, think about it, y'all, a bunch of students on here. How many Black male professors have you had here?
That's what I was just going to bring up.
If we only advertise to certain type of places, we only get certain types of applicants. So for me, in my role here, it's about advocating for how we adjust policies, not personalities, not people. How do we change the policy?
That's it. Same thing. It is making it, becoming aware of it ourselves. When we see it, depending on where you are, calling it out. But even in the position that I am, like when Sunny came to me about this diversity talk, my first thought was, what? No, I'm a white woman. Why did you come to me? Now I know why. I know Sunny, and we've had these discussions, and I know him. But then my next thought was, I need to go to Shantae. So that should tell you, immediately, because I start thinking, and that's when I realized, because I wanted to get more than just two, but timing, it doesn't always work out. I wanted to kind of have different people. I start trying to put it together, and that's when it hit me. Who do we have that's a Black male instructor or professor here anymore? We had Michael Smith in sociology, and that's when it's like things like that start to come to play, and making that aware and looking at the reasonings why and what's understanding it and just being aware of it, just talking to people. I think that's the big thing, is people don't want to talk about this. Again, they get uncomfortable. Talk about it. I'm always willing to talk about this in particular. Find me, we'll talk.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate you ladies coming and doing this and being panelists on this discussion. I really enjoyed it myself, and I know there's a couple comments here that advocated that they also did too. There's more questions, but we don't have time to get to them, unfortunately. It looks like we got like 2 minutes left before our time's up here. But once again, I want to say thank you to everyone that joined. Thank you for the cooperation, for everyone that muted their mics and turned off the cameras and decided to come and listen to this discussion today. We're hoping to do more of these, so stay tuned for that also. And once again, thank you to everyone. And let's give a applause in the chat if we can for our ladies who came today and took time out of their schedules to do this for us.
Yay, Shantae.
Hey, Tracy, I know that there are some questions. I'll be more than happy to answer them in the chat after we end the meeting, because the chat should still stay up, assuming this Teams works like every other Teams that I've been in. And I'm going to go ahead and put my email address in the chat. So if there's something that you wanted me to address, you can absolutely feel free to email me. Beyond that, both me and Tracy's offices are over here in the Liberal Arts Building. We kind of live here. So,
No doubt.
feel free to reach out.
Absolutely, I agree. I put my email in there as well.
Awesome. All right. Well, once again, thank you. And until next time, you all have a great day. We appreciate it.
You too, Sonny. Thanks for hosting it.
Of course.
Thank you.
Of course. Welcome.